Economic history. All right. So you have the topics on the outline you sent is pre-colonial economic issues, colonial economic structure and implication, industrial sector, trade, commerce and banking, post-colonial economy and development efforts. Okay, so infrastructure, all right, currency and all of those ones are also involved. So I'll try to treat about three or four. Right, so starting with number one, pre-colonial economic issues. So the economic history of West Africa, of pre-colonial West Africa in the pre-colonial period was predicated on a number of traditional agricultural technologies, that is, with farming mechanisms, household farming, and traditional trade networks, characterizing the pre-colonial economy. Of course, the environment also shaped or dictated the nature of the economy of West Africa in the pre-colonial period. That is to say that the topography of the forest and savanna regions of West Africa favored the growth of various agricultural crops from Dakar to Lake Chad, all right, a distance of over 2,000 miles. They extend a belt of undulating grassland, studded with trees, basically, all right, and this actually dictated what the people produce and what they consume. So since winter never comes to West Africa, all right, also low temperatures are no obstacles to plant crops. That's the meaning. So the main vegetation zones, have existed in West Africa since about 3000 BC, and they are the product of a drying out process which started about 12,000 years ago. So the West African people unequivocally, undoubtedly, are developed from inception a suitable mode of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption, which form the bedrock of the economy of West Africa. So, among which is agriculture. Agriculture, which formed the cardinal bedrock of pre-colonial economy, was virtually mobilized by a combination of indigenous technologies, communal land tenure system, and extended family productive system. That means labor supply. Right, that is the meaning. So among the many factors that that engendered economic development in pre-colonial West Africa was a strong economic relations between the various groups. The communal system that existed, was one of the critical factors that sustained inclusive development. And I think until the coming of the Europeans in 19th and 20th century, the various pre-colonial states maintained a diplomatic and mutual economic ties. So the goods were exchanged from one communities to the other, intergroup relations, intercommunal community trade, long distance trade. This fostered profound economic activities and enterprises. So of the most paramount was agriculture, as I've mentioned, which was the major occupation of the bulk of the people of West Africa. And this is understandable. The fertile soil and the two annual rains, in West Africa, encourage the growth of agriculture, especially farming. So, beside farming, West Africans, West Africa was also famous for specialized crafts like wood carving, metal works. Weaving was also an important industry that the people practice. So people produce through the wood carving. They produce domestic and household instruments like chairs and tables, beds. All right, metal works. Were used from blacksmiths. Produce agricultural implements. Traps for hunting, even guns, and also pot. And all of this. Weaving, which was also an important industry, sustained engendered massive production of clothing materials and cloth making and what have you. So iron smelting and blacksmith industry also appear to have been vastly practiced in different parts of West Africa, especially among the Yoruba people, the people of present day Nigeria. So the pre-colonial economic system in West Africa generally operated on the basis of demand and supply. and it was conducted essentially with the aim of maximizing social relationship rather than economic values. So that is to say that the people of West Africa were not really concerned because the society was communal. It was not capitalized, so they were not really doing business because they wanted to make money or accumulate wealth. They were making engaging in businesses to widen social relationship, so that people, for instance, someone will produce 20 tubers of yam and exchange it with 2 gallons of water. They don't care the value of the commodity in relation to what they get, but what they just need is that their basic existential needs were supplied, were met, all right, through barter system, exchange system. So, however, there were a number of factor markets and institutionalized means of selling land, hiring labor, and raising money, even though the economy was highly communal. So, the dominant agricultural sector was virtually immobilized, all right, immobilized, that is, by a combination of low or traditional technology, and communal land tenure system. Only by traditional technology, they use simple implement, cutlass, old shovels, and then the land tenure system enabled them to redistribute land. So there was no shortage of land. There was limited or no unemployment, all right, or underemployment in the pre-colonial African economy, because the land was communally distributed by the chiefs, and they ensured that there was inclusivity, that everybody's interest need was represented. So what was the problem in the pre-colonial system was even labor. Land was, if you have read the work of Anthony Hopkins, Economic History of West Africa, land was in large supply. The vast arable land in West Africa provided the opportunity for everybody to be included in the productive system of our enterprise. All right, and labor, which constituted a challenge, was supplied through the extended family system. As Anthony Hopkins argued, that the development of key entrepreneurial groups was also inhibited by the prevalence of anti-capitalist value system, showing that the reason why the people of West Africa did not industrialize or develop in the pre-colonial period was because of the communal system, whereby everything was basically to widen social or affinal relationship rather than maximize capital. So the communal economic system, according to Hopkins, prevented prospective innovators, all right, to inject capital to accumulate savings. But that wasn't the core values of African society, because they were not interested in injecting capital into the economy, people accumulating wealth, as it is, for further creation of wealth. People were, bothered about the needs of the general community. Right, towns and villages were a common feature of the West African landscape, all right, and market system. Market existed in towns and villages, all right, to ensure that. So you went to the farm and produce cassava. You don't just take it to a market for. They ensure that people in the community are first and primarily taken care of, all right, by those commodities before they are traded outside the community. So there were also variations in terms of inter-regional market and all of that, all right, and this was a critical feature. So African towns are also not only sheltered farmers, they also house specialized personnel such as craftsmen, transport contractors, all right, hoteliers, and merchants. Okay, there were people who were craftsmen who came from one place to the other to maximize their skills. All right, there were transport contractors, those who use various means of conveying goods and services and people. All right, and the people, just as we have hotels in modern day, there are people who constructed homes for migrants to settle, for traders to lodge. All right, and there were merchants also who were involved in the commercial activities, either as stockbrokers, those who know the value of one commodities to the other. All right, in the context of the pre-colonial African society, and there were the money lenders, the stockbrokers, and the money changers. All right, so and these were the focal point of exchange of goods of all kinds, and they were also very important administrative and administrative leaders, all right, in the scheme of things. So the movement of labor from one place to another was also not typical characteristics of colonial regulations. All right, it was established feature of the traditional economies. The fact that migrant laborers moved from one place during the colonial period, and this was a system entrenched in African society, in the pre-colonial period before the advent of colonialism. Especially before the advent of slave trade, which hindered that. So people who had always traveled, either for commercial or socio-cultural reasons, moving, exchanging their goods with, for instance, people from the forest region would travel to the savannah region in search of what commodities they didn't have at home, and ditto for the people of the savannah, to the forest region, and or people from the forest region traveling to the coastal communities to obtain aquatic, commodities, fishes, crayfish, and all of that, which they needed to augment, the meat, and which they obtained through hunting and all the stuff. So the most important economic unit in virtually all West African society was the household. All right, the household was not often associated with the family and was very capable of adapting to to meeting the changing conditions and to create new opportunities. So the household, because it was a communal system, it was the most viable unit of productive activities. Every commercial activities, for instance, if you watch that movie called Lisa B, all right, if you watch, there was a system of arrow that they use in mobilizing laborers to the farms. Okay, this was a typical system. So a typical town in pre-colonial society had consists of a particular household. So each societies were grouped on the basis of household, right? And this household have number of people, biologically related, including slaves, all right, and migrants who are sheltered under the household, who constitute the labor supply on on an individual farms, all right. And occasionally these units were mobilized for collective agricultural productivity. For instance, the household of Mr. A would invite other household in the town or village to his farm, where they mobilized because labor was scarce. Right, land was largely available, surplus. So they combined the labor, on rotational basis system, right, which engender productivity and inclusive development. So the household was not often associated with the family and was very capable of adapting, to the changing needs and opportunities, as I've mentioned. A large household, could divide itself into several smaller units without necessarily breaking up, the family. All right, and there was also a considerable degree of occupational specialization. It was not that every household, were farmers. There was specialization, both on seasonal and permanent basis. All right, even across gender. So, although slave labor was prevalent in pre-colonial society, the point is that labor supply, was a major problem in spite of all of this. Even though people had slaves, it was the only means of production that was scarce. Even the number of slaves could not, provide supply for them. And that is the reason why, the people resort among the Yoruba to arrow system, whereby rotational labor supply was generated by the entire community. People mobilize themselves, according to age grades and gender, to a particular person's farm, and the following day they move to another person. And this was a system, it characterized. So this is a general broad view about the pre-colonial economic system. Let me treat the second topic on colonial economy structure and implication. All right. You know that before the 19th century, the European powers were represented in Africa by large state chartered companies and by individual traders rather than by regular soldiers and professional administrators. That is to say that during the period of the obnoxious slave trade, the Europeans had established their forts and stations and offices in various parts of West Africa. All right, so chartered companies were prominent during the early phase of the seaborne trade with West Africa, especially from 15th century up to the early 19th century. All right. Okay. So, especially during the 19th century, so this company were given trading monopolies over various sections of the African coast in return for fulfilling certain obligations by their host country. For instance, in the Netherlands, the leading officially sponsored firm was the Dutch West Indian Company, which, beside having interest in the Caribbean, was also active along the West African coast. All right, during the 18th and 17th century. So the most important French companies were the Compagnie des Indes Occidentales, all right, which was founded by Colbert, all right, on the ideas formulated by Richelieu. The Company du Senegal also in 1673, and the Company du Guinea. These were some of the European firms that already established in different parts of West Africa. You remember that you have different the francophone West Africa, we have the anglophone. So the principal English concern in West Africa was the Royal African Company, which established its presence from 1672 and which succeeded the aptly named and unbusiness-like Royal Adventure into Africa. All right, so the presence of joint stock companies in some branches of foreign commerce was mainly a result of the desire of subscribers to share, the risk of African trade, all right, which was notable. So this is a quite simple illustration to say that before the beginning of colonial enterprise, there were already in Africa several European interest companies, all right, which were approved or licensed by their own countries, either in France, in Britain, in Netherlands, in Portugal, whichever, in different parts of West Africa. So it was through the instrumentality of these companies that colonialism started in West Africa. All right, at the beginning of the 19th century, thereabout, starting with in Senegal, in Gambia, Sierra Leone, Lagos, and what have you. So I need not waste time on the history of colonialism. The topic is colonial economy, the structures and the implication. So I'll just go into the origin of the colonial economy basically in this section to give you all right the structures and implications. So colonial economy or colonization force was simply an extension of the trading ties that existed over 400 years between Africa and Europe. Okay, so in this case, peasant agriculture characterized most part of the region of West Africa during the beginning of colonization. Peasant agriculture characterized the essential productivity in the colonial period. In the other topic, I talked about the nature and the characteristics of pre-colonial economy. So this pre-colonial economy was shaped by the introduction of cash crop agriculture, which was a typical deviation from what existed in the pre-colonial system, where there were diversification. People engage in craftsmanship, in guilds, in goldsmith, blacksmith. People were not necessarily on that, but the colonial economic system reconfigured the people into peasant agrarian people producing what cash crop, because the abolition of the slave trade in the 19th century necessitated the need for the people to switch from slave trade induced activities into cultivation of cash crops. Some of the crops that were not indigenous to Africa but were in high demand in Europe: palm oil, palm kernel, which were needed in European industries; cocoa, all right, which was needed to satisfy the chocolate demand in Europe and America. All right, you need rubber, for production of tires and shoes and leather. You need tobacco and all of that. These were the typical characteristics of the colonial economy. All right, so production of these were based on peasant agrarian system. Production pattern were also conditioned by land availability, as we have noted in the pre-colonial economy. And trade, in this case, trade involved slaves, gold, ivory, salt, and other commodities. Trade in slave, is been argued to have deprived, the region of enormous, human capital, in the earlier century, as you have noted. So the trade in the different items continued, except the trade in slave in the 19th century. All right, the trade in different items, continued on the middle of the 19th century when the European government decided to take administrative control of the regions they, traded with, after the Berlin Conference of 1884. So the decision to colonize large part of Africa was, of course, you must have been told, was driven by, many factors. But key is number one, a need to supply the industrial revolution with undisrupted flow of raw materials in large quantities. All right, two, and also, of course, to obtain cheap labor and the need for the new market for industrial goods. Secondly, there's the strategic competition among European powers, all right, both politically and militarily. And the third is individual odds edge, the adventurers, sought to achieve fame for their own country. And this was what birthed the idea of colonial system. All right. So I want to go to the structure of the colonial economy in West Africa. So there were basically three types of colonial economies in Africa. All right. The first is peasant statist regime, known all over West Africa, no part of East Africa. Two, there is the settler economies that developed plantations using huge, huge labor reserves, all right, in different parts of West Africa and even Southern Africa and East Africa. And then three, there is economy organized around chartered companies, especially in places like Congo, basically. All right. So let's look at them one after the other. The peasant statist regime were basically primary commodity export enclaves. All right. The colonial government provided the minimum of infrastructure to ensure that export crops will be produced by peasant farmers and shipped to Europe. So what they needed was basically to maximize, those commodities. They didn't care about the infrastructure as, maybe one of the topics to look at the infrastructure. Taxation was tended to make the administration self-sufficient, and social services were minimal, largely coming from the missionaries. So the core essence of colonial activities was the maximization of the profit, rather the careless about the infrastructure, that was needed to convey, all right, or to improve the level of productivity in this agricultural enterprise. So the state, and that is the colonial government, determine what should be produced for exports, in what quantities, and also determine producers' prices. These were some of the structures put in place, by the colonial authorities. There was minimal private participation, even outside agriculture, and hardly any processing took place. So such that all the palm oil that were produced, all the rubber, the cocoa, were not refined in the colonies. They were exploited, to the European industries, which were refined into finished produce that were later traded back to the people, the colonies. In the settler economy, plantation agriculture was controlled by European settlers, that confiscated land and marginalized indigenous people. So investment was much more significant, as the owners of the capital also lived, in those colonies in some of these places. So while exporting mainly primary commodities, also the role of the government was minimal, therefore influencing largely the incentive structure. So the colonial, in terms of the structure, the colonial system was characterized by the need to maximize incentives for the colonial government, with little or no improvement on the state or the condition of the people. In the chartered economies, all right, the main characteristics was the involvement in mining by those chartered companies, especially this probably in part of francophone West Africa, all right, where mineral resources were discovered in large quantities, in places like Mali, in Niger, all right, and quite a number of French-speaking areas where the main characteristics was the involvement in mining by those chartered companies. The French chartered companies mobilized their technologies to exploit raw materials. They didn't focus like the British on agriculture. So the little regard for agriculture and associated labor and infrastructure, was only to support mining and related activities. So there was little attempt to develop domestic governance structure, and no investment in human capital development and social services existed. So in many economies, in some of these places there were reforms in some colonies, kind of stuff. So so largely in response to the growing nationalist agitation. This was later in the 20th century. And so those reforms brought in greater participation by the indigenous people in the running of the colonies, and this was quite later event in the 1940s and 50s. So I will look at the implications. What were the major legacies or implications of colonial economy? Basically, under this question, the topic. So hardly any industrial production, was introduced by the British, all right, in different parts of West Africa. All right, the monetized economy, could be found in only select regions of the country, especially in Ghana and Nigeria. So the colonial government monetized the economy. The economy was quite capitalized, and this actually led to the level of uneven development in the colonial system, colonial West Africa, and there were hardly any domestic markets for land, labor and capital outside agriculture. Okay, so land became capitalized as opposed to what we discussed about the pre-colonial system, where land was highly communal. It was redistributed by the chiefs. All right, there was no scarcity of land for labor for production. But under colonial rule, land became a subject of contestation among people. That people had to, because it now became something that was capitalized. Money was now involved and all of that. So entrepreneurship was quite absent in most colonial, West African society, as opposed to what the colonial system apparently destroyed the indigenous entrepreneurial, drive, because of the need, so that they will not compete with the European goods that were coming. So most of the indigenous craftsmanship, productive weaving, and other goods that were produced in West Africa, were dismantled because of the need, to sustain the high quality or market reach of the European goods. So internal trade in primary commodity exports and manufactured consumer imports were mostly with the dominant colonial power, trade concentration. All right, and so for instance, the Europeans ensured that while Africans supply only raw material, their countries also were involved in exporting European goods like textile, all right, and shoes and all the other consumables into the colonies, and they ensured that monopoly was in place, that the indigenous goods did not compete with the foreign goods. There was significant social inequality in the colonial economic system, and also there is ethnic and regional inequalities, which became profound in many parts of West Africa, and fragile class system also emerged during the pre-colonial period. So these were some of the highlights of the topic, colonial economy, structure and implication. Let me add that to the topic on implication of colonial economy, all right, the consequences, all right, was the hegemony of imperialism, all right, which is invariably associated with an agrarian crisis in many of the countries in West Africa brought under colonial rule. And this is evident from the case of West African agriculture, because the colonial period saw a more or less perpetual agrarian crisis, whose starkest manifestation was in the form of recurring famine, food insecurity in the colonial state, because the colonial government, the Europeans, had compelled the people of West Africa not to produce some of the indigenous staple foods they used to consume. They had been compelled to produce only cash crops needed in Europe. So in the context of West African agriculture, colonial capitalism began with the transition from the indigenous mode of production into a capitalized system of production, and this actually bettered uneven development. Even in agricultural sector, there was surplus productivity in cash crop production, but there were no food insecurity in the context of domestic indigenous food crops like yam and all the stuff that people needed for their everyday survival. And this brought about the cash crop economy, which was promoted, was quite devastating. Right, it devastated the land. It led to land degradation, environmental abuse, famine, and perhaps the worst, the worst famine ever recorded in African history, where millions of people lost their livelihoods, under the colonial economy. So the British and the French, economic system, introduced massive famine and widespread poverty and exploitation of natural resources, before they left in 1950s and 60s. The shortage of indigenous food produce, at the end of the British rule was because of emphasis on the cultivation of cash crops such as cocoa, rubber, groundnut, coffee, palm oil, palm kernel, through which the colonial government, realized exorbitant revenue. So this agrarian crisis under the British and the French in West Africa was because of changing land tenure system, excessive exactions from the local people in form of inflation, all right, caused by an abysmally high level of deficit financing of agricultural programs, in addition to excessive tax collection and all of this. So the victims of the agrarian crisis, created by the Europeans, were often the rural people, consisting of the peasantry and the agricultural laborers. But in addition to farming, there was debt, there was destitution and dispossession of the peasantry, which were a common feature of colonial economy. You have to state that explicitly. And such rapacity on the part of the colonial government was not just an arbitrary phenomenon. It was necessarily linked to the development of capitalism, which grew in Europe and America. So capitalism in the colonial states, all right, requires a number of primary commodities consisting of raw materials and food grains, which the Europeans cannot do without, all right, and at the same time, they cannot grow within their own boundaries, either, at any level. So these actually were some of the means through which Africa was subjected. West Africa people were subjected to the orbit of to ruthless motive exploitation by the Europeans. And in many African countries, the economy and the environment are yet to recover from the effects of the colonial economic system introduced by the British. The introduction of commodity produce was an existential crisis. All right. So, but agrarian crisis, whether in form of the reduction of indigenous food crops as percentage of agricultural export commodities, or in terms of the devastation it brought in terms of food insecurity, or in form of debilitating taxes, all right, cannot be isolated from the structures and impact. It was also the same in the French area, in the Francophone speaking area, as it was also in the British area. I guess in the Francophone area, it was even more worse, where extractive activities of mineral resources actually led to more disappearing livelihoods, as people were displaced from the agricultural lands because the French were searching for mineral resources. So with the adoption of neoliberal or capitalist policies, all right, under colonial period, the many livelihoods were lost and the people suffered tremendously. Talk about infrastructure, all right, which is key. You have to, because you can't escape the question on infrastructure, all right, whether railway or road transport. So I think the most prominent infrastructure is the railway that that will feature in the exams. All right, quite to the best of my understanding. So whichever way the question is framed, so what you need to know is the history of railway or the introduction of railway infrastructure in West Africa. All right, and this question is usually situated within the larger context of European imperial contribution to infrastructure development and economy of West Africa. So railway development in West Africa was inspired by the popular belief that the railway had played a crucial role in the march of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and the remarkable economic development in North Africa, India, and Australia during the 19th century. So the clamor for railway development in West Africa was started by private interests from the middle of the 19th century. Many of the railway promoters were enthusiasts who formulated grandiose plans, but lacked the financial capacity to execute them in different parts of West Africa, whether Ghana or Gold Coast, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Nigeria. So the early railway schemes were not well defined, and the attendant high cost did not commend them to colonial officials. Consequently, until the last quarter of the 19th century, railway projects in West Africa failed to secure official government support, whether in British West Africa or French in West Africa. However, development in the closing quarter of the century compelled the European powers to reconsider their attitude to railway development. First, there was a heightening of imperial rivalry as the colonial powers were required to make good their colonial acquisition. On the other hand, railway would facilitate the quick dispatch of troops to quell uprising by Africans during an ongoing colonial conquest. So the colonial government thought about this and felt, okay, it was not a bad idea to invest in railway infrastructure, not because they really love to improve the condition of the people. On the other hand, it was also good proof of effective occupation and was a potent weapon for the diversion of trade to particular ports in the interest of the colonial power. But I think a more fundamental, but less strategic consideration was the onset of the depression of the 1880s and 1890s. So officials and merchants were now convinced of the need to construct railways to ensure West Africa's competitiveness in international markets. So as colonies were required to be self-financing, officials had to adopt measures that promoted the trade of the colonies, upon which rested the fiscal system. Consequently, railway schemes ceased to be private undertaking as colonial government took over their planning and execution during this period. So looking at French railway first, the French interest in railway development in West Africa was intensified in the 1880s as the conquest and colonization of vast West African hinterland got underway. Okay, so between 1879 and 1882, concrete plans were formulated for the construction of the Senegal Railway, and with an approved budget of 120 million francs, the project took off in 1882, and the line from Dakar to St. Louis was completed in 1885. The line got to Bamako, about 720 miles inland in 1923. So subsequently, works on the Thais-Kei line, which was interrupted by the First World War, was also resumed in 1920. And when completed in 1923, they gave, it connected, it provided outlets, between Sudan and Dakar. And this line, traversed the most productive, granite producing zone, of the French, areas, the Dakar, Niger, and Dakar, St. Louis. All right, lines were linked also in 1923. In Senegal, a 46-kilometer branch line was constructed also from Diourbel to Touba. All right, the spiritual quarters of the Maurits sect and a great granite producing center in French colony. All right, so another branch line from Lutiga to Ligueri, all right, was however a large waste as it ran through and unproductive region, basically in the French region. So railway construction on the Ivory Coast also began in 1903, and the line got to Bouac, about 315 kilometer inland in 1912. So attempts were made to extend it to the Guadagu, in Upper Volta, all right, where about 558 kilometers were actually was constructed, and from there the French also expanded it to Guinea. So in Guinea, the railway line from Conakry to Kankra was completed in 1914, and all plans for further extension were never realized. And in Dahomey, the Pobe Porto Novo line built between 1905 and 1913 was extended to Cotonou, which about 108 kilometers in all. And between 1928 and 30, all right, several railway constructions or infrastructure were introduced by the French. The central line, go to Paracoy, all right, somewhere in the extreme of the West British area in in Benin Republic, basically. So, and these were some of the phenomenal railway in Togo. Railway development in Togo had been the idea had been introduced by the colonial government before the end of the 19th century, but it wasn't until the 1930s that the French made decisive efforts in completing railway facilities, all right, that connected Lomé to Atakpame, all right, and Blita and Lomé, Anecho and Lomé, Palime lines, and all of these were later development in 1930s. All right, and the Germans in Togo also try to influence railway infrastructure for their own purposes. What about the British areas? So railway construction in British West Africa started under much later in British West Africa until around 1890s, because the British adopted a policy of minimal involvement in the region. They were only interested in taking, they were not ready to give back. So although Britain had laid claim to its West African colonies by treaties and conquests, okay, it still had to make its presence felt in many parts of West Africa. So colonial officials had to contend with the issue of land rights and specifically indigenous reactions to railway constructions on African land. So the parsimonious attitude of the British Treasury, also their stinginess, also hindered the forward policy on railway development. The British were not ready to commit themselves financially into any form of infrastructural development, all right, during the period, unlike the French, which saw the need. All right, okay, so these were some of the primary consideration, and pressure for the construction of the railway line came expectedly from British business community, as I've noted at the introduction. So it was motivated by fear of the prospects of the diversion of trade from British colonies to railway lines in the adjoining French colonies, since the French had invested much in railway construction. So in addition, there were reports of mineral deposits such as of gold on the Gold Coast, which quickened the tempo of demand for railway construction to facilitate mining operation in the interest of the British capital. So British merchants, ship owners, bankers, and colonial officials ultimately reached a consensus on the features of railway construction. All right, so colonial government rather than private promoters started constructing railways and started managing them themselves. So second, a standard colonial rail of 3 feet 6 inches was approved for Nigeria, all right, the Gold Coast and the Gambia, while a narrow gauge of 2 feet and 6 inches was approved for Sierra Leone Railway, given the poor finances of that colony. So by that passage of the colonial loan bills in 1899, colonial government could now incur public debt to finance railway construction. So unlike the French colonies, railway construction in British West Africa preceded piecemeal. During Chamberlain's tenure as Secretary of State, much progress was made in pushing the railway lines inland from the coast, and uh, consequently, by 1906, a line had, the railway line had been created from Freetown, reaching Bahama, a distance of 222 miles. And by 1903, a shorter line, from Pendembu was completed in 1909. On the Gold Coast, railway construction proceeded from Accra in stages. Takwa was reached in 1901, and Obuasi was in 1902 was constructed. The line from Sekondi got to Kumasi in the heart of the rich Ashanti region in 1903, and the Accra Kumasi and the Accra Sekondi lines were completed by 1923 and 1927 respectively. In Nigeria, construction began in Lagos in 1896, and the line was extended to Ibadan in 1901. Jeba on the Niger in 1909, and Kano, where about 711 miles inland, was constructed. Okay, so Port Harcourt Enugu Jos line, linking the northern and the eastern part of the country, was completed in 1926 by the colonial government. So by 1940, there were about 5,200 miles of railways in British and French West Africa. So all railway development was a product of what Anthony Hopkins characterized as official entrepreneurship, given the deep involvement of the colonial government. It was driven by the need to maximize the export of agricultural and mineral resources from the colonies. It was not born out of the genuine interest of the Europeans, whether British or French, in developing the colonies. So investment in railways paid off and realized the dreams of government and the merchants. So Michael Crowder indeed regarded the railway as a major legacy of the colonial policies of the colonial powers, while Omosini concluded that they have had perhaps the greatest impact on any single innovation in transport brought into West Africa from Europe, and that is quite true. All right, so such comments in no way deny the contribution of other modes of transport, particularly road transport, which competed with complemented the railway. But indeed, in spite of the negative effect of railway construction, it laid the foundation for the development of railway infrastructure in post-colonial West Africa.